It has been described as one of the worst outbreaks of political violence this century. Observers have repeatedly described the bloodshed as a genocide. I'm not talking about Gaza here. I'm talking about Sudan. This East African country has experienced a horrific but largely forgotten and ignored war that is only now somewhat simmering down. I am Borzu Dergahi, the founder of Badlands, a newsletter and podcast about war and politics and anything else I might find interesting. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. That's Borzou. The war in Sudan has left tens of thousands dead and cities and towns in ruins. The violence and trauma of Sudan has largely been overshadowed by the Israeli offensive in Gaza and now by the US and Israeli war against Iran. But one of my colleagues, one of my friends, has recently traveled to that country for the Los Angeles Times. Nabih Bulos, he's a foreign correspondent at the paper, and he just got back from Khartoum to Beirut, I think is where you're at. And I wanted to catch up with him while the memory of the trip was fresh in his mind. Welcome, Nabih.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, so tell us a little bit about the trip and what the situation there is for ordinary people before we get into the mechanics of it and so on. Has the fighting totally wound down?
Well, let's say first of all that it took me quite some time to sort of be able to go to Sudan in the first place. I mean, getting a visa wasn't easy, and I had tried quite hard to get it. I know we'll talk about that later on, but
Yeah.
just to give you a sense of all this, it had taken me about 6 months to finally, even get to the point of being able to apply for a visa. So when I finally got it, I really, really pushed hard because, as you said, this is a forgotten war, and I thought it was important to sort of, just be there and cover it in a more detailed fashion. Now, the timing obviously was not fortuitous, right? And in truth, I had expected that this might be a problem, but I thought, that I would at least have a few days before things were kicking off, perhaps, and that I would be able to go in there, do some good work on Sudan, and that, even if a war would begin, it wouldn't reach Lebanon. But then, of course, as I was there, obviously,
The war
the
started.
crap show began here, right? And so I had to run back to Beirut. So all this is to say that I spent a mere 10 days in the country, and it
Oh,
is
that's pretty
nowhere
good.
near enough.
Right,
It's nowhere
right.
near enough because it is so huge that it takes really 2 days just to get anywhere.
Yeah.
So, of those 10 days, I would argue that maybe four and a half were reporting. Sorry, that's my cat. Sorry.
That's amazing.
Sorry, pardon me. Sorry, big kitty. Anyway, so the problem is that I mean, it's a shame too because the story is so fascinating, so multi-layered. I will push back in one thing in saying that it's not a forgotten war. The fact is that for the countries involved, and there are so many goddamn countries involved, it's not forgotten at all. But what is forgotten is the people themselves. The people of
Hmm.
Sudan are truly forgotten in the war. That is perhaps the most tragic aspect of it. Now, to answer your question after this huge preamble, right? Um, the first thing is that the war has wound down in Khartoum, right? I think that is fair to say. But the potential for war in Khartoum remains quite high, and the war continues elsewhere. And in fact, in some places, has even intensified. So, I mean, the sad part about the Sudan war is that again, this is such a huge country. We're talking about sort of various grievances, coming in together, and neighboring countries have been fueling it. Well, I mean, perhaps not fueling it, but certainly facilitating, right?
Right.
Right,
Well,
its
I'll
its
get to
continued
that, but I,
conflagration.
I really just wanted to ask, in terms of what you saw, um, are there no-go areas? Are people fed? There was a risk of famine and so on? Is the general humanitarian situation better, worse, same? How would you say it
So in
is?
Khartoum, it is better, right? I mean, again, it's fair to say that sort of in the northeast parts of the country, right, in Khartoum, things are better. Elsewhere, for example, in Kordofan, yes, there's no famine, but in the actual, sort of displacement camps, there simply isn't enough food to feed all the displaced, right?
Yeah.
So whereas we haven't reached perhaps the desperation levels we've seen in the past, right, it still is quite desperate for, very, very large numbers of people, right? And Khartoum itself, uh, I mean, there's no war over there happening right now, but I mean, the capital is just slammed. It's hard to sort of explain the scale of destruction. I mean, we sort of overuse like in one's imagination, the word war zone, right, tends to imply sort of, like everywhere being destroyed, which, as you know and I know, is not usually the case, right? Like, I mean, the word war zone is a misnomer in many ways because, it's more like a war donut hole where the donut hole is perhaps destroyed, but the donut is okay, right? I might not
Yeah.
buy real estate there, but it's fine, right? There are shops, etc., right? Now in Khartoum, the fact of the matter is that you actually see, war zones in the literal sense of the word, right? I mean, entire neighborhoods are just wiped out, right? And wiped out and looted and
Mm.
burned. I mean, it's a sort of fighting that reminds you of areas like the Ghouta in Syria, right? Just this like relentless fighting, block by block, coupled with airstrike, coupled with mortars, coupled with artillery. It is just a crap show, right? Now there are other parts that are, relatively fine, but again, I mean, the capital is divided into three I mean, it's sort of like three cities in one, right? And
Right.
it's all divided by the Nile River. And all these beautiful areas on the Nile are just destroyed, right?
Wow.
And you can't imagine, the money coming in to get this fixed up. You just can't see it. I mean, you see these vast towers that have
Yeah.
turned into basically, just kind of like Swiss cheese, right? Because of these huge sort of artillery strikes. Even the National Museum, they've just started recovering, sort of all that's been lost and trying to fix it up. And I'm writing about that now. It's tragic. And the fact is that the scale of the destruction is what makes it all just seem insane.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could get into a little bit about the history of the conflict and how it came about. I know it's really long and twisted, but just in general, starting with the main fighters, the Sudanese army and the powerful militia that was once their ally. Can you tell us a little bit about that history and why they were fighting, and perhaps
Sure.
how this kind of became how this war was born out of a democracy movement, if I recall.
So actually, that's when I was supposed to go to Sudan the first time, right? I actually had gotten a visa to go right after the revolution, and my intention was to go and check it out. And then I forget what happened in 2018.
Well, start
So it
with that
started in
revolution.
2018.
Start what happened in that revolution?
So I mean, very simply, right? There was the usual sort of economic grievances involving people just not being willing to get
They
by,
raised the price
and
of
that's
bread, as I recall.
they raised the price of bread. And there was already trouble when it came to gasoline, etc. And so basically that started into these sort of large scale economic protests that then, of course, morphed into the usual, we want Bashir, the longtime strong man, to
Omar
lead,
Bashir. Yeah,
right?
he was wanted by The
Omar
Hague as
Bashir.
well. This guy's a war criminal. Yeah.
Exactly so. Not a nice guy, right? And so what ended up happening there was that, eventually the army, right, as it does, right, went in and did a coup, right, and installed
To
this
preempt a
general, right.
popular revolution, basically. Yeah.
Exactly so. And the idea was that this general, he was going to have a sort of mixed military civilian
Hybrid.
government. It
Yeah.
was supposed to be a matter, yeah, it was supposed to be like like a temporary situation. And then sort of
Yeah.
2 or 3 years later, they would sort of just, go and cede it to the civilians. This, as you can imagine, did not happen, of course, right? Because then the army, right, and its then ally, the Rapid Support Forces, which was a militia
The
before, but that
Janjaweed,
then
isn't that what they call the
Janjaweed
Janjaweed?
is the origin of it. Well, so Janjaweed is the origin of it, right?
Yeah.
Bashir, as is the wont of many dictators, can't necessarily control all the various armed forces under his group. So he would employ sort of shock troops, right? And he would create these factions that were shock troops, right? The Janjaweed were essentially that, where they could sort of go in there, loot an area, kill everyone,
Mm.
right? And the pay was the bounty they would get, right?
Wow. Mm.
So that ethos extended to the rapid support forces, which was
Yeah.
sort of the development or the evolution, more accurately, of the Janjaweed. They were integrated into the government, right? They became a part of the armed forces. Now they weren't part of the army. This is crucial, right? They were part of the armed forces, and so at the time of this military uprising again, right? They basically kicked out all the civilian, let's say, element of their government and said they would just lead it on their own. But eventually, right, the two heads, right, of the major armed factions, the army and the RSF, they came to blows. And the idea was that the RSF basically didn't want to integrate, in the army. There were a few sort of, conditions and problems, and this then led to sort of wide-scale fighting in Khartoum that lasted, at least a year, right? And by its end, Khartoum was absolutely just decimated as
That
a
was
capital.
2023, if I recall, or 2022.
Correct. 2023, I believe,
Yeah.
and it's just extended. Actually, 2024 is when the Khartoum trying to think like when they entered because it's been such a confusion.
Yeah.
So they entered last year around Eid al-Fitr, right? The army came in again into Khartoum, and it had been a year plus. So yeah, give or take 24 or like end of 2023. So it was a real obviously a huge mess, and the army now has yes it's had Khartoum under its control for the last year, but reconstruction efforts, as you can
Yeah.
imagine, are extremely limited, right? There's still a fear that the RSF can still come in, right? In
Where
fact,
are the
they're
RSF
fighting.
now? Where are they?
So, so it's surprisingly close. If you look at the map, right? Right now, the
Yeah.
RSF is fighting a do or die battle in this area called Kordofan, right? Which, is about, if memory serves, about 300 kilometers or so, roughly speaking, from Khartoum. That doesn't sound like, I mean, that's not a lot if you imagine, because the fact is that right now, the whole point of the RSF is to take over Kordofan, because then they can actually start launching drones on Khartoum, right? Right now, the power projection of the Rapid Support Forces, right, is based on drones, and these are all supplied by various actors. We can talk about that in a bit.
Yeah.
And so their plan now is to take over Kordofan and use that as a staging ground to attack Khartoum, and then of course, ideally get to Port Sudan. And in fact, Hemeti, who is the head of the RSF, was recently quoted in the press as saying in a speech that were it not for the drones of Sudan, of the Sudanese army's allies, we would now be in Khartoum and Port Sudan. So let's be
Okay.
clear, right? The aim is to take over the entire country, right?
Yeah.
And that's why the fighting continues apace in various areas, but especially in Kordofan and also in what's known as Blue Nile States, which is near Ethiopia.
Yeah. So you know what I don't understand is okay, so you have this fight between this army and this militia. Why did so many how many civilians died? I mean, do we even know?
Uh, like 150,000 is what I've heard. I mean, it's just been an
Wow.
insane amount, right? It's just a huge amount of people being killed, and the damage is just incredible.
So, but
Um,
why did so many civilians get killed? I mean, were the civilians taking sides in the conflict? Were there areas of the country that were under the army control and other areas under the RSF control, and those people were on the side of the army or the RSF, respectively?
I mean, there wasn't
Or
necessarily anyone on the side of anyone, right? I mean, the
uh-huh.
civilians were often just caught in the middle. I mean, I'll give you an example. Now Khartoum is a city of graves, right? And the fact of the matter is, like, you walk around, you will find makeshift graves on the sidewalks. You'll find makeshift graves in university parking lots. It's just madness, right? And the reason why is because these civilians were stuck there, right?
Wow.
And these areas were basically being bombed all the time by
What,
the various actors.
but didn't the actors or the various actors didn't they want to win the people over? Isn't that part of the point of the war or no? Excuse my confusion.
No, not at all. I mean, in the case of the RSF, they didn't care about winning the people over because, again, the RSF's ethos is to loot, right? That's how they sort of pay, for their people, right? That was the idea. Again, this is from the Janjaweed days.
Sounds like a
At the
biker
same
gang or
time,
something. Yeah.
essentially, essentially, right? And they are effective fighters in that regard. At the same time, when you're talking about the army, no, their intention was just to take charge of the area, right? To take
Uh-huh.
control. And so they were lobbing artillery, you had airstrikes. I mean,
So there
yeah,
was
it
no
was.
attempt to kind of minimize civilian damage as these two forces fought each other?
It's hard to say, right? I mean, I wasn't there to see the fighting and to sort of talk to them about and sort of interrogate that particular notion. But honestly, the results speak for themselves. If you
Yeah.
look at the capital, you can tell that the place was just turned into gigantic Swiss cheese. Now, of course, I should note, right, that I entered, uh, under the government's auspices, and so I was, I had a minder with me, from the army,
The whole
and there
time.
was very firmly the whole time, well, almost the entire time. I mean, there were a few moments, when I could sort of go and do my own thing,
Sure.
but in terms of reporting overall, I had to have a minder with me. But with that being said, right, it is fair to say that I saw a lot of areas, civilian areas that had been, ostensibly under army control, that had been absolutely just slammed with artillery and drones and other stuff like that. At the same time, you'll see, areas that were also under RSF control and that were subject, most certainly to, Sudanese army artillery attacks as well. So, I mean, let's be clear, there are perhaps no angels in this, but on balance, it seems the RSF has been worse, and we've seen, just reports of these horrific infractions and violations.
How does the RSF get how does it get its weapons? And why isn't the international community, at least to some extent, uniting against one of these forces or condemning them and so on? They sound like pretty bad guys. I mean, not that the Sudanese army are good guys, but like,
No.
do they have a way? How do they get their weapons and resources?
Well, so okay, the Sudanese army, of course, as an army which is working, under the government, right, it gets weapons that way, and it has had a few countries that have been, let's say, helping it out, right? One of them is Egypt, right, for obvious reasons. Egypt does not want, chaos on the southern border. Saudi Arabia is now helping out as well. Same thing with Turkey,
So
and for a
Turkey
while,
is
although I'm
on the
sure that's not
side of
happening
the
now.
Sudanese government. Turkey, Saudi,
Correct.
Egypt. Okay.
Correct. And Iran as well. Iran at some point in time sold Shahed drones to the Sudanese government.
Uh-huh.
Now I'm sure it's not doing that now, let's be clear, but back then it was doing that, right? And in some ways the US is sort of kind of behind the Sudanese government, right? Because it is interested in having, government basically in charge. Now, the RSF on the other side has I mean, officially, right, the UAE denies all links to the RSF and that it is only interested in humanitarian
The
work.
UAE, you mean the United Arab Emirates, right?
Correct, correct. The Emirates. Now, at the same time, right, there has been plenty of reporting, and there have been many reports by a UN panel of experts, right, pointing out that the UAE has been the main supplier of the RSF. And what does that mean?
Wow.
That means that that means that the RSF
Wait,
is
isn't the
paying.
UAE also an ally of the US? Like, not exactly a
Yes.
treaty ally, but like a significant
Well,
partner?
pretty close. I mean, pretty close. It's a pretty big ally, right? Whether it comes to the AI build out, whether it comes to the military things. I mean, and whether it comes to the Abraham Accords, right? The intention here, the UAE is supposed to be, let's say, one of the main Gulf countries that is very much on America's side. But it should be said, right, that the UAE has been pursuing let's say, more pugilistic foreign policy in Africa, and the climax of that has been in Sudan. Now, what has it been doing? Let's talk about that because it's a bit complicated. Now, the UAE has essentially constructed a dynamic and I must say resilient supply line that stretches from Libya all the way to Sudan and thence to Yemen, right? Now, the ultimate aim in theory is to be able to sort of facilitate access to the Red Sea and sort of be able to protect power there, because obviously you have all the ports of East Africa and you were talking about a string of ports that are quite valuable. That's sort of the, geopolitical
Yeah.
aspect of it. But, on the ground, what this means is that the UAE has been able to use its networks in Libya, in Chad, in Somalia, and elsewhere to supply the RSF with drones and material of other
I'm
sorts.
just confused why it would do that.
So the, there are two elements here. One, right, is that the UAE sees the sees the Sudanese armed forces as very much an ally of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, obviously the main sort of, I suppose, nemesis of the UAE, right? They
Yeah.
fear the Muslim Brotherhood a lot, and it should be said that there is Muslim Brotherhood
Omar
influence
Bashir
in
was
the armed
considered
forces.
Omar Bashir was considered the deposed dictator who's now, I believe, in the Netherlands on trial.
Yeah.
He was considered very close to the Muslim Brotherhood as well.
Exactly so. And you also have a situation where, there are various elements of the intelligence and the armed forces, and there are even some of these factions, right? These paramilitary factions that are also quite Islamist, right? And so I think actually just maybe 2 days ago or yesterday, the U.S. government sanctioned the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan as well. So, there are some Islamist, let's say, elements there, and that has been the UAE's main bugaboo in many countries, not just Sudan, but also in Egypt and
But wait,
elsewhere,
I got to ask
right?
you a question though. So why would Egypt, if in fact it's so close to the Muslim Brotherhood, this government, the Sudanese army, why would Egypt support it? Because isn't Egypt even in some ways even more stridently anti-Muslim Brotherhood?
It is indeed, but Egypt cares about not having chaos on its borders. It
I
should be
see.
said that when the war began, you had hundreds of thousands of Sudanese coming into Egypt, right? Or maybe even a million plus.
Mm.
So the fact of the matter is that, it is a problem for Egypt, right? It does not need to have chaos. And the RSF, regardless of their, let's say, non-Islamist credentials, are very much chaos agents, right? And you can see this already, right? If you sort of track the RSF's advance in Kordofan, you can see waves of displacement coming through, and they all settle in this town called Ubayd, which is another place that I visited. And I mean, ironically, it's the worst part in the world to be when there's a huge news event because it takes so long to get
Long.
out.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it took me a good 3 days to be able to even like approach an area that I can get to. Um, it was madness. But I was very happy that I went because it's in Kordofan and it is very much under attack all the time. I mean, you are talking about a nightly barrage of drones, dozens of drones. It's kind of like the Blitz, you know. I mean, imagine it's like what the Blitz felt back in the day, right? Where you just have this, wave of bombers coming in and then the AK fires begin. This was the same case, like you're sitting there at night, let's say 3 a.m. or even in the afternoon at times, and you just suddenly hear sort of the whoosh of a SAM and the firing of some of these big ACs,
Yeah.
and it's because of a drone, right? That is flying overhead, and then comes another, and then another.
Wow.
It was really quite striking. I mean that both literally and non-literally. Just the sheer number of drones we're seeing every night, and all that is because of the UAE's pipeline to the RSF, right? And the pipeline goes from many, many countries. It is very dynamic. It can come from Chad, it can come from Ethiopia, it can come from South Sudan.
Sure.
It can originate in planes that are leaving, let's say, like runways in Abu Dhabi, right? It can originate in the ports of Bosaso or Puntland. It's just simply, incredible the scope of it,
So
right? And the effort involved.
just to give listeners and viewers an idea, much of Sudan's borders are basically not really borders, it's just open desert. If you've ever been to that part of the world, it's like there's no difference really between, Libya, Chad, Sudan, Egypt, southern Egypt. It's just one big expanse, the sort of eastern edge of the Sahara. So there's no real way to interdict smuggling, and it's a big huge paradise for traffickers and weapons and so on. Tell me a little bit about the economics of it, if there are any. I know that Russia was somewhat involved. There was a little while ago, I haven't heard these stories, some rumors about the Wagner group, the mercenary group that was involved in this, also for the purposes of plunder and rare earth minerals and so on. Is that still a case, or has Russia packed its bags and gone home to deal with Ukraine?
Well, so Russia, it's a bit different right now. I haven't seen much about the Wagner Group in recent times, but the fact of the matter is there's plenty of people who are quite voracious when it comes to Sudan's riches, and they are, as you mentioned, plentiful. So gold obviously is the biggest one, right? That's the biggest issue. And I mean, the irony of all this is that, the old gold souk was absolutely destroyed and ransacked in Khartoum. And yet, even though devastation has hit other parts of the capital and really like other industries, haven't recovered, the gold industry has now basically opened wholesale in another part of town, one of the few
Wow.
areas that is not so destroyed. Right? I mean, all these shops that were in one big building now have opened up on this main thoroughfare on both sides. And again, it's one of these sort of ironies of war is that the gold is being sold on both sides, whether it's the RSF or the government, right, to the UAE, right? The UAE remains to be the main, let's say, importer of Sudanese gold, right? And so even as you are, you know, I mean, even as you're sort of trying to fight, uh, the RSF, you are at the same time fueling, right, their
Sure.
war machine with the gold you sell to the UAE, which it then, by the way, smelts, turns around, fashions into jewelry, and turns around and sells it to Sudanese, right? So you see in these shops in Khartoum, all this UAE produced gold jewelry. So I mean, the ironies never end.
Yeah.
You look at other places too, where you have, for example, gum arabic. Now, I mean, gum arabic doesn't sound like a very exciting crop, but it is, yeah, it is a cash crop of the first order, and some of the best gum arabic grows in Kordofan. So I went to the main market there, and you can
Did
see that
manage to go to
before,
Kurdistan. You did, and you, if I may just interrupt for a second,
please.
you went to the RSF controlled areas?
No, 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 no. I went to the areas that are still under the government control.
Okay.
So let's explain. Kordofan is actually quite a few areas, right? It's quite a large region, um, and and so the RSF has been fighting to gain control of a trio of cities. One of them is called Kadugli, the other one is called Dillinj, and Ubayd. Right, Ubayd is where I was staying. Now the idea was to actually go all the way to Kadugli because the government had apparently recently broken a siege on it, but
Uh-huh.
that did not happen. And perhaps it was a good thing because about a day or two after I arrived in Ubayd, the RSF managed to actually go and attack Dillinj again. So
Yeah.
it was dicey there as well. Anyway, so now the government remains in control of Ubayd. It's broken the siege on Ubayd, and so we were able to go to it, right? Even though it was actually touch and go in many ways. And again, you can see just the sort of the use of drones almost as like an aerial IED. They just lob them.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't to say that they're totally random, right? There is method to the madness, right? They are attacking military targets at times, but other times you just see them attacking, this university, and it's unclear why they did it, right? It seems to have no, real use, right? And you can tell it was a targeted attack as opposed to a drone being shot down and going off course, because they've hit it 3 times. You can see, just looking at the roof of the thing, you can see sort of these three big blasts, and the lecture hall just absolutely destroyed. Um, it just seems wanton, for lack of a better way of saying it. Yes. Sorry, it's quite depressing in many ways, I have to say,
Yeah.
because the fact is that it's a hugely important story, and the scale of the destruction is just so large.
Huge.
But at the same time, I mean, just getting around is really so difficult, right? It's a very hard place to work, I must say,
Yeah.
for a variety of reasons, but we can get into that later on.
Yeah, like I gotta just ask this, because of the humanitarian crisis that you described, what does the country need right now? Is there any way to help? And is there, for example, a way that international community could help at this point? It seems obvious to me, so I'll prompt you on this, but couldn't the US and Israel and all these other countries that have relations with the UAE put pressure on the UAE to stop supporting this element? So at least one side just, flat out wins since both sides are kind of rotten.
Well, so I mean, in theory, there is much the U.S. can do, right? And there is also the idea that it is possible, perhaps, for like let's say more stringent interdiction of arms and things like that. But at the same time, again, you are talking about a very, very resilient pipeline. So sort of doing this, let's say, against the UAE's will is not going to happen. It has to be a situation where the various countries engage with the UAE. They try to reassure,
Exactly. Right.
they try to reassure it in many ways. Um, but the fact of the matter is that this is also refracted through the lens of the competition for Africa, where you have, Qatar, you have Turkey, you have others all vying for a slice of this massive, massive pie. So I mean, now the UAE, might not be, let's say, amenable to the notion of cooperating with these groups because it wants access to these ports, and it has managed, through its, strategy so far to actually gain access to a large number of set ports, in East Africa. So, it might not feel the need, let's say, to be, let's say, friendly, right, to any kind of overture of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think are the prospects for that democracy movement that we talked about? I remember interviewing these amazing people, some of them in Sudan, some of them in the diaspora, doctors, engineers, lawyers, civil society activists who were, they just seemed genuinely well organized, disciplined in terms of their stated goals and so on. I thought if any opposition movement had a chance of taking over, it could be Sudan. What has become of them?
I mean, the tragedy is that, nothing. I mean, at this point, we just cannot see the prospect of anything like that happening.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is the army, has shown no interest at all in talking to the various democracy movements. It's creating now, it's trying to sort of deal with this upstart group. I mean, not even an upstart group. It's a group that it's totally co-opted and that it's sort of working with, right? The RSF has also done this kind of, let's say, window dressing group called Ta'sis. But all this stuff is really nonsense and must be, I have to say, just so painful for those democracy activists, many of whom were killed back in the day by the RSF and others, the government as well. I mean, the prospects seem very dim, I must say. The fact is the war hasn't ended. It's unclear if Sudan will ever be able to recover as a country as we know it, right? At least in the short term or medium term, let's say. At the same time, it's hard to talk about democracy when the war is still ongoing and the army remains very much in charge, or at least in the capital. And if the RSF, does manage to get into Khartoum, I don't see them being much better. This is the sad part. The people with guns are the ones in charge, and I don't see a situation where they can be beaten by any kind of democratic movement.
I guess the last question I wanted to ask you before Zoom kicks me off, but for any journalists who might be listening or watching, what is it, how is it getting the visa, getting there? You mentioned you had to have a minder most of the time. Was it possible
Yeah.
to do real reporting though?
Yes, it was possible to do real reporting. It is also hugely expensive to operate. You will need a very strong car to go around the country. If you can fly UN Haas, fly UN Haas because other airlines are very, very unreliable in many ways.
Yeah.
At the same time, it took me ages because I had to sort of find the right people and find the right embassy to do it. I finally went to the one in Amman, and after much back and forth, I was able to finally find the right person who could help me out in the government in Khartoum, and then I sort of did that. Uh, once that was done, it actually did take a long time. I was lucky. I was told that others, it's quite hard for them to do it, but I was getting the security allowance quite quickly. Um, but yeah, I mean, it won't be easy. Let's put it that way. You have to get to Port Sudan, right? Then you have to fly into Khartoum potentially,
Yeah.
or drive, 11 hours. If you want to go anywhere, it is at least, like I said, a
Huge
2 day,
country.
at least a 1 day trip. It's huge, right? Operating, without a minder can be is basically impossible because everyone will ask. You also, like won't necessarily get what you want, right? I mean,
Yeah.
every day of reporting, you wake up, you then go and get permission from the intelligence people,
Yeah. Whatever you
right?
can get.
It
Yeah.
is very, very tightly controlled. It reminds me in some ways of Assad's Syria. That was a bit worse, but this was very controlled as well. With that being said, you can indeed do proper reporting. I mean, certain things are just sort of, obvious, right? The drones that are coming are definitely RSF drones, for example,
Yeah.
right? You can talk to various people and the displaced, and yes, there'll always be sort of, like asking you about the notes, etc. You can, I think with some, ingenuity, you can probably do a good job of reporting both sides as well, because it's important to note that the army, aren't angels, right? And they too, have engaged in terrible practices. Again, the RSF on balance seems worse, but one can sort of be fair about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not easy, right? It is not as hard a place to work as, for example, Saudi Arabia, where you get no information whatsoever. At least in Sudan, you get information, right? It might not be great information, it might not be, and it certainly is usually horrific. But with that being said, you can do real work.
Nabi, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Again, this is Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands. It's at Borzou, Borzou .substack.com. Please subscribe. Please tune in. Please share. Thank you so much.